The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs as people shuffled into their seats, waiting for the trial of the year to begin. Cameras were set up, reporters jotted notes, and every seat was packed. All eyes were on the front of the room, except for one man who quietly entered through the side door, unnoticed. He wore a long, faded coat that hung off his shoulders like a curtain. His shoes were worn at the edges, one sole slightly flapping with each step. A pair of oversized glasses slid down his nose every few seconds, and his gray beard looked like it hadn't been trimmed in weeks. As he made his way to the last row, a few people glanced his way, wrinkling their noses or whispering to each other. "Who let that guy in?" One young lawyer sneered to his colleague. "He probably wandered in off the street," another whispered, chuckling. "Hope he doesn't fall asleep and start snoring." The man didn't react. He simply nodded politely at a nearby guard and took his seat in the back row, folding his hands in his lap. His eyes, though tired-looking, scanned the room sharply. He watched the lawyers gather their notes, observed how the jury settled in, and even noticed a stain on the prosecution's tie. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just watched. The lawyers continued to joke quietly, tossing glances at the stranger like he was part of some joke only they understood. No one knew his name. No one cared. But what they didn't realize, what they couldn't have known, was that the man they were mocking had more power in that courtroom than any of them, and he was just getting started. The court recessed briefly before the trial officially started. Lawyers grabbed coffee from the side table, court officers chatted near the entrance, and the hum of casual conversation filled the room. But one group, gathered near the prosecution's desk, seemed more interested in gossip than law. "Did you see that guy in the back?" snorted Prosecutor Halverson, swirling cream into his coffee with an unnecessary flourish. "Looks like he walked out of a thrift store during a tornado." "That coat," added Defense Attorney Shelby, shaking her head. "I swear it might have walked in before he did. Smelled like mothballs and bad decisions." The others chuckled. A bailiff, who should have known better, leaned in and said, "He asked me where to sit, all polite and formal. I almost laughed in his face. I told him anywhere that's far from the judge's bench." They all roared. None of them noticed the man in question gently rise from his seat and walk to the water cooler nearby. He moved slowly, quietly, and poured a cup of water. Though his clothes were shabby, his posture was straight. He didn't glance their way or react to their words, but he heard every syllable. As he returned to his seat, he passed by one of the younger interns who made a face and whispered, "Hope he doesn't start asking for spare change next." Still, he said nothing. But if they had looked just a little closer, they might have noticed something strange, how his eyes flicked from person to person, studying their names on their badges. How his hand, though old and wrinkled, held the cup with surgeon-like precision. And how, beneath the silence, there was a storm waiting to break. By the time the judge's seat sat empty for 10 whole minutes, the courtroom was buzzing with impatience. Everyone had gathered for the long-awaited trial of Gregory Vance, a powerful businessman accused of embezzling millions and bribing city officials. Cameras were ready. Reporters scribbled notes. The stakes were sky high. Finally, the bailiff stepped forward and called, "Court is now in session." But instead of a judge entering, another official approached the bench and murmured something to the court clerk. She nodded, then turned to address the room. "The Honorable Judge Parker is running behind. Please remain patient." Groans rippled through the courtroom. At the front, Prosecutor Halverson stood proudly, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He wore an expensive suit and talked with the kind of confidence that dared people to doubt him. "The evidence is overwhelming," he told a nearby reporter. "This trial won't last a week." Across the aisle, Defense Attorney Shelby rolled her eyes. "You're dreaming, Halverson. My client is innocent, and I'll prove it, without breaking a sweat." The two lawyers clearly despised each other, and the tension between them crackled like dry leaves before a fire. Neither one noticed the man in the back row watching them closely. As opening statements began, despite the judge's absence, the courtroom felt like a pressure cooker. Halverson paced dramatically while showing charts and documents. Shelby objected often, and the clerk looked increasingly uncomfortable having to keep order without a judge. But even amid the chaos, the scruffy stranger didn't blink. His hands remained folded. His eyes never wandered. While others saw noise and pride, He saw the cracks forming beneath their polished acts. And he knew this trial wasn't just about money or crime. It was about justice, and soon it would be his turn to speak. The courtroom was a storm of arguments and objections. With the official judge still absent, the lawyers were treating the hearing like a stage show. Prosecutor Halverson strutted back and forth, waving documents in the air. Defense attorney Shelby slammed her hand on the table, demanding fairness. "Objection! The prosecution is twisting the timeline again," Shelby barked. "Oh, please," Halverson shot back. "Maybe your client's timeline is just full of lies?" The jury looked confused. The clerk looked helpless, and the stranger in the back row leaned forward ever so slightly. Then quietly but clearly, a voice rose from the last bench. "That statement violates Rule 403 of the Evidence Code," the man said calmly, voice gravelly but precise. "You're misleading the jury by combining facts that don't belong together." Heads turned. "What did he say?" someone whispered. Halverson froze. "Excuse me?" he called out, glaring toward the back. "Who even are you?" The stranger stood slowly. "Your Exhibit B contradicts Exhibit D, and you failed to establish chain of custody for the email evidence. Anyone paying attention would know that." A wave of gas spread across the room. "You need to sit down," the clerk warned, eyes wide. "You can't interrupt the court." "I wasn't interrupting," the man said gently. "I was correcting." Halverson stormed toward the back row. "You think you know the law better than I do, old man?" The stranger raised one eyebrow. "Perhaps." "I want him removed immediately," Halverson shouted, furious. The bailiff rushed over and grabbed the man's arm. The courtroom burst into murmurs and laughter. Reporters scribbled madly, but the stranger didn't resist. As he was led out, he looked over his shoulder and said just one thing: "This court deserves better." And then he was gone, at least for now. The courtroom doors creaked shut as the stranger was led out by two uniformed bailiffs. Though his steps were slow, his face remained calm, almost peaceful. Inside the courtroom, the mood had shifted, but not in the way anyone realized. "He's probably some washed-up law student who never made it," muttered Prosecutor Halverson with a smug grin. "Or maybe he just Googled court rules last night." "I've seen internet trolls with more tact," Defense Attorney Shelby added with a chuckle, flipping through her notes. "Anyway, now that the peanut gallery is gone..." Back in the hallway, the stranger paused. "You don't have to escort me far," he said kindly to the younger bailiff, who looked slightly embarrassed. "You're just doing your job. I understand." The bailiff hesitated. You really seem to know what you were talking about in there." The older bailiff scoffed. "He pretended to know. That's not the same as being a lawyer. Let's go." The man nodded again, but as he walked down the marble-floored corridor, he whispered just loud enough for them to hear. "What this court needs isn't noise or tricks. It needs the truth. And I promise you, the truth is coming." The younger bailiff glanced at him sideways, eyebrows furrowed. Back inside, the reporters were already tweeting about the mystery man who crashed the courtroom. People joked that he might be a conspiracy theorist or just someone looking for attention. No one guessed the truth, not even close, because in less than an hour when the court reconvened, everything would change. The man they laughed at, shoved out and ignored, would return, and when he did, he wouldn't be in the back row. He'd be wearing the robe of the highest authority in that room. 20 minutes later, the courtroom doors opened once more. Everyone turned, expecting to see Judge Parker finally arriving. Instead, a tall man in a gray suit stepped in and walked briskly to the clerk's bench. He carried a sealed envelope and wore the serious expression of someone with important news. The chatter died down. The clerk leaned forward as the man whispered something into her ear. She blinked, nodded, and stood slowly. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "Attention, everyone, there has been a reassignment." Murmurs spread instantly. "Due to an unexpected scheduling conflict," she continued, "Judge Parker will not be presiding over this case. The court has appointed a replacement, effective immediately." Prosecutor Halverson raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean, a replacement? We weren't told anything about..." But then the doors opened again, and in walked the same scruffy man from the back row. Only now, he wasn't wearing the worn coat or sagging slacks. He wore a judge's robe, The room went silent. The bailiff's jaw dropped. Reporters froze mid-sentence. Halverson's coffee cup trembled in his hand. Defense attorney Shelby's eyes were wide as saucers. The stranger, now not a stranger at all, walked calmly to the bench. With quiet authority, he climbed the steps and took his seat behind the gavel. He adjusted his glasses and finally spoke. "I am Judge Elijah Grant," he said, his voice clear and powerful. "Senior circuit judge, appointed by the state to oversee this case." No one moved. Halverson finally found his voice. Wait, you're the same guy? What kind of prank is this?" Judge Grant looked down at him, expression unreadable. "No prank, just justice." He tapped the gavel once. "Court is now in session." And just like that, the game had changed, forever. Silence clung to the courtroom like thick fog. No one could speak, not even the always confident prosecutor Halverson. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, but no words came out. He stared at the man now seated behind the bench, the man he had mocked, dismissed, and demanded removed. Defense attorney Shelby looked like she had just swallowed a lemon whole. This can't be real," she muttered under her breath, clutching her legal pad as if it might protect her from the embarrassment flooding her face. Judge Elijah Grant sat tall, dignified, and calm, but there was a storm behind his steady eyes. He cleared his throat and spoke, his voice smooth but firm. "Before we proceed, let me remind everyone in this courtroom of something crucial. Justice is not a performance. It is not loud voices or expensive suits. It is truth, delivered without pride or prejudice." The jurors straightened in their seats. The bailiff stood a little taller. Only Halverson seemed frozen in disbelief. "You were sitting back there, watching me?" he finally stammered. "Yes," Judge Grant replied. "I watched how you treated someone you assume was beneath you. I saw arrogance, mockery, disrespect, not just to me, but to the law itself." The color drained from Halverson's face. Shelby tried to regain composure. "Your Honor, we didn't know." "You didn't ask," Judge Grant interrupted, raising a single finger. "You judged a man by his coat and glasses, not his knowledge, not his character. Isn't that ironic? In a courtroom?" The reporters, once quiet, now scribbled with a fury. This wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning. "Now," Judge Grant said, adjusting the nameplate in front of him, "let's begin again, properly." And just like that, the courtroom felt like a very different place. The judge had returned, but the lesson had only begun. Judge Elijah Grant scanned the courtroom from his high seat, his gaze sharp and steady. No longer did he wear the disguise of a weary outsider. He now commanded the room like the storm he'd quietly been holding back. The transformation wasn't just in his robe. It was in the silence, the respect, and the weight of truth that had settled on every pair of shoulders. "Let's begin with a review," he said, flipping through a stack of documents with the precision of a man who didn't just read files, he understood them. "Prosecution, please present your timeline again." Halverson stood slowly, eyes lowered, his earlier arrogance visibly gone. His voice trembled slightly. "Yes, Your Honor." As he walked to the center of the room and tried to recover his confidence, Judge Grant interrupted him, not harshly, but with firm authority. "Before you proceed, correct the inconsistency in Exhibit D. You omitted a key piece of metadata from the email timestamps. That's a misrepresentation of digital evidence." Gasps, more scribbling from the reporters. Halverson flushed. Yes, Your Honor. I'll make that correction." Next, Judge Grant turned to defense attorney Shelby. "You stated earlier that your client never accessed the company's private accounts. However, security logs from 2 weeks before the breach say otherwise." Shelby opened her mouth in protest but stopped. She realized, almost painfully, that he was right. "I'll double-check those logs, Your Honor," she said, voice steady but humbled. What followed was nothing short of a courtroom masterclass. Judge Grant dissected arguments with calm precision. He asked questions no one expected, spotted gaps no one had noticed, and corrected both sides without favoritism. The jury leaned forward. The clerks took notes in awe. Even the bailiffs exchanged wide-eyed glances. The trial wasn't just back on track. It had become something greater. This wasn't just a courtroom anymore. It was a place of reckoning, and Judge Grant was here to make sure the truth stood taller than anyone's pride. The trial had moved faster than anyone could have anticipated. The once chaotic atmosphere had been replaced with an almost eerie stillness. Judge Grant, in his steady command, had transformed the courtroom into a space where only truth and logic could thrive. No longer was the case a spectacle. It had become a battle of facts, precision, and legal expertise. The prosecution was on its heels, struggling to keep up as each piece of their evidence was methodically questioned and dismantled. Meanwhile, Shelby, on the defense, had made no attempt to disguise her relief as Grant's probing questions seemed to subtly favor her client, Gregory Vance. The room had been tense all day, but as the day's session drew to a close, a sudden, unexpected turn shattered the quiet. "Your Honor," said a voice from the back of the room, an unfamiliar voice. Everyone turned. The voice belonged to a young woman, dressed in a smart suit, who had entered without anyone noticing. She wasn't a lawyer, at least not one anyone had seen before. The entire courtroom fell silent. "I need to speak," she said, walking slowly down the aisle. Judge Grant, unfazed, motioned for her to approach. "Who are you, and what is the nature of your testimony?" The woman took a deep breath. "My name is Isabella Hayes. I was an intern at the company Gregory Vance owns, and I have information that will change everything." Whispers filled the courtroom. People leaned forward, their eyes wide with curiosity. "I was the one who uncovered the first evidence of the financial discrepancies, but..." She hesitated. "But I was silenced, threatened. The real story, the real culprit..." She paused dramatically, letting the tension build. It wasn't Vance. It was someone much higher up, someone connected. The air seemed to freeze. A collective breath was held. Everyone's eyes were now on her, on the edge of their seats, waiting for her next words. And Judge Grant? He simply nodded. "Please continue." The room was about to explode. The courtroom was a powder keg, and Isabella Hayes had just lit the fuse. The tension was so thick, it felt like the very air itself had been electrified. Everyone in the room was holding their breath, waiting for the young woman's next words to unravel the truth. Judge Grant's eyes were sharp, unwavering, as he gestured for her to continue. Isabella took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly, but she steadied herself, as though the weight of everything had already been placed upon her shoulders. "Gregory Vance isn't guilty," she said, her voice stronger now, the words slicing through the silence like a blade. "The real person behind the financial crimes is someone much closer than you think. It's someone in this room." Gasps erupted. The entire room looked around, their eyes darting between one another. Shelby, the defense attorney, blinked in disbelief. Halverson, the prosecutor, gripped the side of the table, his face draining of color. "Who?" Judge Grant's voice was low, controlled, yet there was a palpable intensity behind it. Isabella's gaze flicked to the back of the courtroom, where a shadowy figure sat, blending in with the crowd. He had been there the entire time, an unassuming presence. The man, a senior executive from the company, looked around nervously, his eyes widening as they fell on Isabella. "It's him," she said, pointing directly at the man. "Richard Hawk. He's the one who orchestrated the embezzlement. He used Vance as a scapegoat." The room exploded into chaos. People shouted. Some stood up, trying to make sense of the accusation. The press was feverishly typing. The camera flashes went wild. Richard Hawk stood frozen in his seat, his face pale, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. His mouth opened, but no words came out. "I've got proof," Isabella added, pulling out a flash drive from her pocket and walking up to the judge's bench. "I found everything, emails, transactions, everything that ties Hawk to the crime." Judge Grant stood up, his voice calm but filled with the weight of justice. "Mr. Hawk," he said, his gaze locking on the executive, "it appears you have some explaining to do." Hawk's eyes flickered nervously, but the game was up. He was cornered. And with that, the truth was finally exposed.